Jason Miles, and this is Revolution Podcast, audio only edition. This is an episode we did that is getting some positive comments. We did with friend of show, Daniel Bessner. And he is working on a new book for Zero Books called Imperialist Realism, play on Mark Fisher's great work with Capitalist Realism, also on Zero Books. And wherever you're listening to this show, there are links in the description to the Zero Books channel, because Pascal and I they run episodes of This is Revolution. Also, we do a video essay series called The Dispatch on Zero Books. And there is a new episode up, which is based on Cedric Johnson's essay on Huey Newton and the internal colony theory called The Forgotten Huey Newton. And part 1 is up now. Enough with that. So this show, we got I wouldn't say derailed, but the conversation took a bit of a turn on defining terminology like fascism, and overall I thought it was a good show. There was a lot of great back and forth. This is one of those shows that, for me, it was a very healthy discussion. It wasn't a fiery, angry discussion. It was just, there were definitely a lot of, well, I don't agree with that, and this is why I don't agree with that. So that's why we definitely talk about imperialist realism, and there were definitely moments where Jean Bajlan kept trying to bring it back. Fun show though. We're talking about doing another show with Bessner on his channel. So again, it wasn't like we were fighting. There is no beef. It was just healthy disagreements. And in any real discourse, you should be able to have healthy disagreements. Now, if you want to be a part of this show, watch it live, comment in the chat and have us address your questions, just be part of the conversation, the best way, YouTube. And then we do these shows every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific time, 8 a.m. Central. I'm sorry, 6 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Central time, 9 p.m. Eastern time. And wherever you're listening to this show, there are links in the description to where you can see it. But youtube.com/This is Revolution Podcast is one of the best places. And for the Tuesday and Thursday show, we go about an hour. This one we went a little bit over because, again, the conversation was so much where it was like, no. Let's let Daniel finish his point. He was the guest. Let's make sure he gets the last word in before we go to the bonus half. He stayed a little bit longer in the bonus half than he said he was going to begin because the conversation was getting so good. If you want to be a part of the bonus patron-only discussion, which is a lot more fun because we actually put the chat on the screen so everybody can see it, it is patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. Simple as that. Again, there's links in the description if you missed it. So, excited for you guys to hear this. Can't wait to hear what the responses are for those that listen to the audio only on this idea of imperialist realism. I actually liked a lot of Daniel's work on the subject. Also, wherever you're listening to this show, there are links in the description to Daniel's writings. again, the book is not out. He does have books out, but not about this. The book is not out, but he does have some articles where he's talking about the idea of imperialist realism. So there should be a link in the description to the last Jacobin essay he wrote, where he definitely gets into this, which I was all set to read a quote from. And I just got this teleprompter app for my iPad, and I was all prepared. I was going to read it before I brought him on, and right before I bring him on, you probably won't be able to hear it in the show. My 2-year-old son runs up and asks for the iPad because we're potty training him, and if he pees in the pot, he gets to watch the iPad for like 10 minutes. That's like his reward for pissing. So he made sure that he strategically planned this pee right before I went on air. And I was very close to being like, fuck no, kid, I'm about to do this show. And then I was like, it's okay. Another time. So I'm very hurt by that. I had my intro, I had this little quote I was going to read, and it was going to go up on the teleprompter. Blippy nixed it. Damn you. Thank you guys for listening. Enjoy the show. This is Daniel Bessner and the Foreign Policy Crew. There was a lot of people on this show. Our guest Daniel, of course Pascal, Jean Bajlan, Kuba Rizniski, and his fiance, who was also a foreign policy expert, Summer Tan. So it was a very full show. Enjoy it, share it. I'm out.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to another edition of This is Revolution podcast. Let me turn that music off real quick. We have a fully packed show. There's so many people on the show right now. Some were invited, some were not. So let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, who apparently is going, as someone put it in the chat, low-key viral. His name is Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. Why am I going low-key viral? According to whom?
Someone shared a clip of you on the Majority Report, and I saw
that. I retweeted that.
And it had a few thousand views when I saw it, and that was earlier this morning. So God knows how many it has now. You're a very likable young man.
I try. I'm glad to be young.
Well, to old people. And
I was talking to Janice Graham, and I was telling her, I was like, Janice, can you believe someone in our chat called me grandpa? She said, I saw that. I couldn't believe it. She was like, that's insane.
Well, I am at an age where I could be a grandpa, and I'm not, Jayla.
That's a good thing, because we know how fertile you are. It's kind of surprising.
Jayla, I'm not. So he is a professor, an author, a rebel rouser, and clean shaven. Mean Gene Bajlan.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you tonight. It looks like it's going to be an exciting show.
So far, so good. And we have, it's couples night here on This Is Revolution. And if it isn't our favorite foreign couple, coming from a hidden bunker somewhere in the great Northwest, it is Cuba in summer. If I had Casey and the Sunshine Band-esque music, or Earth, Wind, and Fire, because that would have been proper music for this. Very happy, black yacht roddy kind of music.
Stop with the yacht rock conversation.
And before we introduce our guest, Cuba, Summer, how are you guys?
Pretty good.
Doing
Thanks
well.
for inviting me back. It's been a few months since I last appeared.
Yes, you are part of the foreign policy family.
Thank you.
That's
Look
right.
at that. It looks funny because it looks like the way Cuba's sitting, like he's waiting for her dad to yell at him.
This actually kind of reminds me of like a new version of the actual opening to All in the Family. You know, the part where they're sitting next together in front of the piano and they're singing. It's like a weird kind of play on that vibe.
Those were the days.
Yeah.
To make the things. That make the hit parade. Cause like we had
I
it.
didn't know this was a music talent show.
Those were the days.
Cuba, you want to sing?
Pascal's got quite a voice. He's got
Your
quite
favorite
a
And we know when
Yeah.
you was
I mean, that was a breakout show for Polish representation.
Before we bring in our guest, we made a special video for him. Check it out. And I just want our guests to know I had to watch entirely too much Henry Kissinger and William Buckley for this show.
Thank you for your service.
Our policy has been firmly opposed to a expansion of the communist sphere or to an expansion to foreign policy adventures by communist countries.
No.
Therefore, to the extent that North Vietnam was engaging in systematic aggression against all of its neighbors, it was absolutely consistent with our policy that we would resist that. To us, the policy of relaxation of tensions with the two major communist countries does not presuppose any degree of ideological approbation. It is a practical accommodation to new realities, and it does not go so far as to acquiesce in any foreign policy adventures. And therefore, at the time of the Jordan crisis of 1970, the building of a submarine base in Cuba, the Middle East crisis in 1973, the administration always reacted with extreme firmness to what we perceive to be foreign policy challenges by any of the communist countries. And I think the American public will have to understand that on the one side, in the age of nuclear superpowers and the capability of destroying tens of millions of people in a very brief time in a war, that the problem of peace is of great consequence. But at the same time, not to disarm ourselves, where we will not resist foreign pressures. Now, this requires a more sophisticated, a more complicated perception of the international environment than was possible in the 40s and 50s. But I see no inconsistency between resisting foreign expansion and attempting to moderate the conduct of the communist countries at the same time.
In recent years, American empire has increasingly faced criticism from across the political spectrum. Even as the Biden administration moved to terminate a generation-long war in Afghanistan, at least officially, the United States continues to maintain a vast overseas military presence. At the same time, it continues to intervene both directly and indirectly across a host of different theaters, from East Asia and Latin America to Africa and the Middle East. Although American political elites might disagree on specific aspects of imperial strategy, the notion that the United States has the moral right to exercise power overseas remains hegemonic. What explains this uniformity of opinion amongst political elites? What is imperialist realism? And what are the prospects for ending empire? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
For a while we say a lot about this word, everybody's using this word now, empire, there's another word that's missing. There's another word that's missing that's very closely related to empire, and nobody ever uses it except a few of us. And that other word is imperialism. Now, isn't that fascinating? How can you talk about empire without ever mentioning imperialism? Because imperialism is the process of empire. Empires do imperialism. That's what they do. They do imperialism. It's like going to a medical conference of pulmonary specialists and they're all talking about our lungs and never once mentioning breathing. You know, you got to say, what is missing from this picture? Well, imperialism is not only the process, it's the political, economic content. Imperialism is when the ruling interests of one country expropriate the land, the labor, the natural resources, and the capital and the markets of another country. Imperialism means plunder and tribute. Empires are not just all about power. It's not power for power's sake. Nobody goes out and just goes and does power. Oh, let's go to Africa and conquer chunks of Africa because then we'll feel more powerful, you know? You go to Africa because there's something there that you want. It's one of the richest places in the world. That's where you got, tin, copper, diamonds, gold, hemp, timber, human beings, slaves, all the stuff that enriches you. That's what King Leopold, he didn't have any grudge about the people in the Congo. He didn't care one way or another about who they were, whether they lived or died. He just wanted them and work them in those mines so that he could get richer and richer and richer. So it's not power for power's sake. It's power to get your wealth and using your wealth to increase your power and using your power to maximize and secure your wealth. That's what it's about. That's what the guys who are in the White House today are doing. So, it's plunder, it's tribute, it's these rich resources, it's expropriating the land, the crops, the cheap labor. Empires are enormously profitable, mostly for the ruling and investing class of the imperial country. Empires are enormously costly for the common populace, both of the targeted country and of the imperial country itself.
Empire for a safe and secure society.
So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.
Talking and you're muted.
You are not muted anymore.
Cool video though. Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I love the music.
Yes.
Also,
That too.
big thank you. If you guys listen to the audio only podcast, I always put those beats at the end of the show. Our guest is a professor, a podcast host. He's an author. What else is he? A journalist. He's
a grunge music expert.
He's a grunge music aficionado, which, if you know me and the way I hate the term grunge, but I do appreciate off air he said punk. So he is the Daniel Bessner.
Daniel Bessner, as they would say in French.
Did you unmute, Daniel?
Thank you for having me. And it actually is a Bessner. The only other famous Bessner was a plantation owner in Haiti, I believe.
Man, you went.
No relation. No relation.
I'm glad you said that, because that is actually where I was going. Since we are talking about imperialist realism, foreign policy, and the American global stage, my first question to you, being that one of the most recent international events that has occurred within the actual purview of America's hemispheric control was the assassination of the Haitian president, Jovenel Moïse. Now, as I am aware of the general machinations of Haitian politics, one of the things that I know about that reality is that no one assassinates a Haitian president without the least the green light of the United States State Department. That doesn't happen, not in modern times. No one in Haiti, anyway. My larger question to you is that in the context of the fact that post-Trump, the Western world is seriously trying to decipher whether or not it is better to make the pivot to China or to maintain its relationship with the United States as the hegemon of record, if you will. This is a decision that is basically up to Western powers that are on equal footing and have the choice to decide, particularly in the Eastern Hemisphere. But what does America's position mean for those countries in the global South in the Western Hemisphere who are not going to have the capacity to make the decision as to whether or not they can pivot to Asia or not in the wake of America's twilight in the eyes of many, if you will? How does that complicate events as we just saw in Haiti, as we're seeing in the global South, as we're seeing in Colombia? What exactly is the play for those countries in this particular conundrum between China and the U.S.?
I think it's the question we should all be asking because it really gets at the fundamentals, which is that the United States has, since the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, I believe, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, has totally assumed that is going to naturally govern the Western Hemisphere, Latin America and the Caribbean in particular, but also all the way out in the Pacific as well. What do I think will happen is that this will continue to be the case, and that, like you said, you're going to need the green lights to do things throughout Latin America and in a lot of cases in the United States through both military hegemony and also, dollar hegemony is going to be able to control the region to a large degree, or at least if not directly control, there is significant agency, at least to kind of create the structures through in which nation states in the Latin American and Caribbean spaces are going to interact within. I mean, given that, I'm not sure that there's much they can do. practically speaking, in terms of resisting the United States' pivot to Asia, or I mean, what is really the United States, in my opinion, biding time before it cedes hegemony in East Asia. I think that's pretty much an impossibility that the U.S. is going to remain dominant there, given just pure geopolitics of China and India, dueling it out in the region, and the various alliances that are going to be created, which are already starting to be created in what I'm terming the post-Cold War period. But what does that mean for Haiti, or what does that mean for Mexico, and even someone that tries to be a nation that tries to be outside the system like Venezuela? It's going to be hard for them to resist it in a meaningful way, where they're going to be able to carve out a third way or even a second way. You could try for transnational workers' solidarity and things like that. And I'm in favor of that, but I think we're a long ways off from transnational workers' consciousness. The international institutions are basically tools of Western supremacy and hegemony, and so I think we're in a pretty dire situation.
All right, let me ask you a follow-up question, and I'll defer to the rest of our co-hosts. What does that mean, number one, for the pink tide or the emerging socialist countries in Latin and South America that we saw in the last 20 years that tried to evolve? I've always made the argument that without a massive socialist counter-hegemon, as we had with the Soviet Union, that, with the fall of the BRICS, that paradigm doesn't seem to have much positive future. And what does that also mean for countries like Haiti, who one of the allegations behind the assassination of Jovenel Moïse was that he was trying to break the monopoly of the Haitian oligarchy and cut deals with Turkey. And some people say even make outreach to Russia to do domestic infrastructure development. Does that mean that those efforts will be thwarted as well?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I'm not an expert on Haitian domestic politics. I generally look to NACLA. I don't know if you guys know that organization, the North American Council in Latin America, based out of NYU. And so my understanding of Moïse in particular was that there was a lot of problems with him. But again, I'm not really a specialist. But I don't think Turkey would ever be able to make serious inroads into the Western Hemisphere for a variety of reasons. Turkey is a middle power. It's really trying to assert hegemony in the Eastern Mediterranean right now. It's involved in Libya. It's involved all over the region. I think it'd be very difficult for them to do anything beyond a sort of symbolic gesture towards them.
Well, we do have the fact that there were executed memorandums of understanding between Erdogan and the assassinated Haitian president. He actually visited Turkey in June, the month before his assassination.
Yeah, no, I have no doubt that something like that would have gone on, but it wouldn't have been able to challenge hegemony in the region in a real way. I significantly have my doubts.
Would it be enough justification for the United States to okay an assassination?
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, the problem is the United States is not a unitary actor. So are there elements of the security state, which includes contractors, which includes, sort of loosely connected special forces across the continent? Would there be some relationship there? That's a possibility. Do I see Joe Biden doing it? I don't see why. I don't think he would be, just given his tenor. He doesn't seem like he would do that, but are there elements of the security state that are probably involved in this? Particularly, the very least, it seems to be a blowback or consequence or aftermath of something like Plan Colombia. I would say so, but it's hard to know. That's my honest answer. I could go to your other question about the pink tide.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And so one hopes that the moves made by left-wing leaders, like Chavez in the past or Lula in Brazil are able to be, advanced upon. Hopefully, of course, Lula comes back to power. I think that, again, is there enough power? Like you said, the BRICS are no longer the BRICS, really. Is there enough weight to serve as a counter hegemon to the United States? I have my doubts. I mean, as you could suggest, I'm pretty pessimistic right now about sort of a new path being carved, at least at this moment. And I think it's important, at least what I try to do is to try to look at power relations in their sort of like ugly truths. And so I don't really see that happening right now. I could be wrong. There could be an exogenous shock, but it seems like the U.S. is pretty much locked into the hegemon in the Western Hemisphere for the foreseeable future.
I will defer to the other co-hosts.
Danny, it's great to have you on, and I have another question for you. So you have a forthcoming title from Zero Books entitled Imperialist Realism. And I would like to sort of zoom out and kind of get your take on what do you mean by imperialist realism, and what is the relationship with that term to the formulation and execution of American foreign policy and America's relationship with the rest of the world?
Yeah. I think it's a good question, and I'll try to explain it. So, of course, there's the famous Frederick Jameson line that Mark Fisher quotes, I believe, in Capitalist Realism, which is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of as it is the end of capitalism, or something along those lines. I basically am trying to like build off of that idea and argue that imperialist realism is just a notion that, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of hegemony. And at this moment, at least in a really literal sense, when we're constantly imagining climate change, global pandemic, just the continuation of inequality, those things seem more likely to happen than the end of the American empire. And I think that has a lot of consequence for how Americans understand themselves, how people throughout the world understand the United States, a lot of impact on U.S. culture, and sort of like the miasma of imperialism that people within the United States, and even more broadly speaking, the North Atlantic world, the Western world, however you want to delimit that, how they experience American hegemony is something that's just incredibly natural, something that's going to been here forever and is going to go on forever. And so that's basically what the concept refers to.
Okay, and would you say this is the dominant ideology then of the people who formulate American foreign policy?
Yeah, I think this is what people mean when they refer to the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, the assumption that the dollar should be the center of international financial transactions, the assumption that the United States should govern the world through armed military supremacy. I think that is just you can't really make a career in official DC if you don't have those foundational assumptions. Now, you might not think the United States should be in the Middle East. You might think like China is a greater threat or whatever, but you still believe that this form of global leadership is desirable and achievable in a real way.
There's the question earlier about China, why it's not very interested in helping or promoting international worker movement. And I feel that it's kind of relevant after what Daniel has said. It's good to set comparison here. China's official guideline and principle of foreign policy is non-interference, not to interfere with domestic politics within any country. Whatever you do, you're a dictator, you're a democracy, you do you. And then we deal with whatever outcome that is. That is the official line. I'm not saying anything else than that. But it makes sense. I think first it's a direct response to the American style big country, and China is trying to find another way to grow up, out of the Cold War context. But on the other hand, this is probably the only way that China can keep itself on the radar of the two countries for so long, and being able to seek its own position in the international society. So that's one of the. I think that's the biggest drive of that. And if you ask China or ask the foreign minister of China, that's what they will say. But I would just kindly hint on the other side of the story, that is, China is not really interested in its own workers' movement much recently, or in the past 40. I don't know, in the history of PRC, I never saw it very much promoting this workers' rights. Especially right now, many people that I engage with or hear from conceptualize China as like state capitalism, because the number one goal of the PRC or the Chinese Communist Party is the region's survival, and they will do anything about it for it. And then they consider the anything that kind of disturbs the society as kind of like destabilizing force. Therefore, workers' movement. Right now, you hear a lot of discussion on the Chinese internet about 996. Some people in China work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. for 6 days. It's common, not just like, and it's sometimes encouraged. So that kind of all of the kind of things are kind of tolerated by the region because they know they kind of sided with money, I would say. And that's why like the workers' movement inside China was never really being supported. So not let alone international working movement.
And to pick up on what Summer was saying and putting it back into foreign policy context, when it comes to the international environment for China's rise, there aren't that many advantages for it to play a kind of aggressively imperialist role in its own sphere of influence or beyond, or to be too forward in sponsoring revolutionary movements, workers' movements, even in countries that it has an adversarial relationship with, like the United States. It economically benefits from the current order. And the World Trade Organization provides it with access to markets. Its management of international investment within China has allowed for technology transfer, for the development of its own industries. So there are a lot of advantages that China enjoys, which would be at risk if they rock the boat too aggressively. Rather than necessarily creating an alternative order based on sort of socialist workers' values, workers' solidarity, it is more of a classic rising power that would prefer to displace the United States as hegemon in the current order, while retaining a lot of the characteristics of what we could call the rules-based international order, just with itself making the rules and at the top.
I don't think China has global ambitions in the same way. I don't think China really needs to or has a desire to dominate the world. I don't think China would ever have 800 military bases. I think it wants regional hegemony. I mean, I do not think they're a friend of the international working class. I mean, I think you've got to be have your head in the sand to believe that. But I do think that they don't have the global vision that the United States does personally. And before I forgot to say, I just started a new podcast called American Prestige that is on foreign policy.
On Chapo.
Yes, and I was on Chapo. So American Prestige, if anyone wants to check out more foreign policy stuff.
Is it basically just foreign policy stuff?
It's just foreign policy, yeah. It's weekly international, not U.S. foreign policy, it's international affairs. And, we go into what's happening in China. We just did an episode on Libya, what's going on there with the, post-peace process. So, just wanted to let everyone know. American Prestige.
Bessner doing it up.
Yeah, they're trying to.
Bessner, I got a question for you, my friend.
Oui.
So here's the question, Daniel Bessner. There were suggestions before the rise of the Biden administration that with the rise of Trump and the reactionary right in the world, Viktor Orban, UKIP in Britain, Brexit, Boris Johnson, Golden Dawn in Greece, Front National in France, blah, 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 the Five League in Italy. There was a discourse that was being held in the world. Some would say it's maybe pedestrian, that we were in an age of a dialectic between the quote-unquote globalists and the nationalists. Yeah, it sounds a little Alex Jonesy, if you will. Or between the quote-unquote neoliberals and the nationalists or the reactionary nationalists. Some people would say that we were or are in the age of impending fascism. Do you think the belief that there is some kind of dialectical or kind of binary struggle between a rising global reactionary nationalist movement and the traditional liberal democratic order post-World War II kind of NATO organizational mechanism? Do you believe that that dialectic is a reality, or is that just the fantasy of those who are rather pedestrian in their analysis of foreign affairs?
It's a question that's been occupying a lot of people. I mean, I think in the end, there's a lot of capitalism. It's not all capitalism, but it's a lot of just capitalism, different sides of capitalism. But it does reflect and refract itself in different ways. You know, the xenophobia of a Viktor Orban or a Trump is different than the sort of global cosmopolitan, you know, free markets of a traditional neoliberal. That is affectively and rhetorically different. But I don't think either poses a serious threat to capitalism. I think that the Trump administration and what other neoliberal orders have been doing, conservative, you know, reactionary nationalist leaders have been doing seem to be mostly just neoliberal capitalism. It's not, you know, the sort of like autarkic or you know, bringing manufacturing back in a real way that, you know, a more traditional reactionary nationalist would try to do. But I mean, they do talk differently, and you know, it has real effects for people on the ground and their lived lives. So I think it's important to also recognize that. But you know, at least in the American context, I don't think what Trump was bears any genuine relationship to what most people mean when they say fascism, which is Nazism or, you know, Italian fascism under Mussolini. I don't think that what Trump did or January 6th or what have you indicates a coming fascism. It indicates good old reactionary American nationalism, in my opinion.
Why do we have to assume that it has to be a Mussolini or a Hitler type fascism? Why can't it be like, you know, what's my man who was in Spain type
Franco? Yeah, then it gets into questions of like, what is fascism? And so my ultimate belief is that in the sense that like you have like a checklist of fascism, and a lot of regimes will fulfill that checklist. Does that mean they're all fascism? To me, fascism is a really historically situated phenomenon. Particularly, it relies on a mass traumatized generation of young men who have military experience, and I don't think that's going to happen again on that mass scale. You can't really have fascism in a moment that is not defined by mass politics. Most people in masses do not affect what goes on in their polities. That wasn't true in the 20s and the 30s. So I think you can't really have any form of fascism without a genuine mass politics, and we don't really have that.
So, but I mean, well, hold on a second. Now, I will agree with you in one way and disagree with you in another. We do have a phenomenon of nationally disaffected men. They may or may not have military training.
That's the crucial part, though. That's the crucial part, in my opinion. And I could go into why.
Well, go ahead. Well, let me ask you a question. My position is that, and I don't understand. I'm not saying I disagree with you, but what I'm saying is that instead of having necessarily brown shirts that are militarized, why can't we just have, for example, survivalist groups or American militias or those types of phenomenon that expand?
Because I just think that the military experience, the literal experience in violence, the sort of traumatized nihilism that informed a generation is fundamentally different from these sorts of like stochastic random militia groups. There's really no, in my opinion, I've read a lot about World War I, and that just sort of the soldierly experience and the bonds that are formed and the willingness to take sacrifices. That really happened on a mass scale that's just not available today. I think that is really the key ingredient of any sort of mass street fighting fascist movement. Sort of the gamers of today are not, forming fascist cadres. It's just a totally different world experience, fundamentally not able to be analogized in a meaningful sense. I think, it's the Marxist thing. It's like the lived experience of the war, the social relations is so crucial to the whole thing. You can't just remove that and then make fascist analogies.
Okay, well, what I'm saying is that why does does that make it any less horrible that it's just reactionary nationalism and not fascism?
No, it's not an ethical or a moral claim. They're both terrible, in my opinion, as sort of a Marxist or a left-wing analyst. I'm making a claim about power, or what I see to be the objective reality of power relations in the world as I experience it. They're both bad. They're both terrible. But I just don't think that the power of the militias today or sort of survivalist groups even approaches what occurred.
What do they call the boys? The
Proud Boys.
Proud Boys. Yeah, I don't think it approaches. I think
Eastern Washington.
I'm sorry?
You ever been to Eastern Washington?
Yeah, no, it's racist and horrible. Don't get me wrong, but the fascists overtook the state. That's a different thing. That's a different quality.
So you don't think the fact that we have 17 states right now enacting laws where literally you have to pay a fine if you teach people about racism, like we're doing in Tennessee, and the fact that we have right-wing reactionaries gutting voting legislation in 13 to 20 states around the country, where Republicans have state power, can easily pivot into a reactionary white nationalist movement that can actually become so reactionary that could actually look like fascism operationally?
It might. I'm saying that I think that's a possibility, and everything I think you said is incorrect. Sorry, it's correct. It's correct. Like, it's incorrect is bad. I think what you said was bad. What you said was correct. That these things are bad. So I do think that. But again, my analysis of the power situation is that it's unlikely that people like that would get the control of the professionalized military. I think that is not a real option. I think we saw that under Trump when the military came out very hard against January 6th. And I think any sort of like national movement like that is going to require the support of the military, a minoritarian movement. Again, I think it's very bad. Everything you said about these laws, these voting rights laws are terrible. We should do everything in our power to stop them. But that, again, is not equivalent of what Hitler did.
I don't disagree with that. It's not equivalent to what Hitler did yet. I'm not saying, well, my point is that we don't know how bad it can get. And my point is,
sure,
I'm not saying it has to be Hitler. There are things that are horrible that necessarily ain't Hitler.
Yeah, but we're talking about fascism, I thought. Yeah, right. Those are horrible, and we should fight them. I totally agree. But we're arguing about the fascist analogy, and that's Hitler.
It's been a long time since I studied political philosophy, so I had to go back and check the etymology of fascism. But so according to Google, it means that this word literally means comes from Italian word for bundle, which represents like bond of people. It kind of go back to the ancient Rome where fascists was a bundle of wood with an axe head carried by leaders. So I feel like there's certain type, like when we talk about this analogy, we need to know what fascism means. And to me, I think this I don't think the analogy stands because there's a very fundamental element lacking in the current America, which is a leader or leading ideology that kind of bundle people together toward the same political goal. I do not think that these nationalists have achieved that yet. Like, it would be very scary if they do, but I do not think they've achieved that yet.
I mean, ironically, Trump could have if he had been more interested in organization and mass politics.
Well, maybe that was the gam. I mean, this is what everyone was saying would happen.
Yeah, but it was too lazy. It was too lazy.
For whatever reason, it didn't. We have to take that seriously. That didn't happen, and Biden won the election.
Yeah, but Trump could win in 2024.
Absolutely,
sure.
Yes.
But I want to kind of pivot back to the foreign policy issue, and I wanted to ask Daniel, about his thoughts on the kind of binary in American politics that seems to be shaking out, which is not entirely defined on partisan lines, between the type of America First policies that are advocated by a significant portion of the Republican Party, including the Congressional Republican Party, and the notion of reviving what many in the foreign policy establishment thought was
America's
a kind
back.
of America's back, baby. Like Biden went to Europe and was like, kind of went America's back, baby, and people didn't buy it. How sustainable do you think this shift is? And I just want to kind of like add my thought in and get your thoughts on this. It strikes me that America First is a kind of a bad policy, but there's a logic to it and there's a realism to it, in that it kind of recognizes that, you know, America is going to have to put America first and other countries are going to put other countries first, but it's a dog-eat-dog world. Whereas the liberal internationalism, or the globalism, depending how you frame it, of the Biden administration and the foreign policy establishment seems to be more delusional in terms of America's, like, even buy-in, right? So what are your thoughts on how successful this pivot is, and what do you think is going to happen to it? Is this kind of the last gasp of the empire? Are things going to like really change?
So I think it's a great question, because I think we're in a really historically unique situation. So if you go back to Rome or the Ottoman or the British empires, when there's decay at home, that generally makes it difficult to maintain the structures of the empire, right? Decay at home leads to, imperial decay abroad. The United States has done something interesting. It's basically created an empire that doesn't need that many people to run. First of all, you have the atomic bomb. So there's like an inherent world-ending weapon that could always be used as a threat. You don't need the mass armies of Napoleon or Hitler or anyone. So you have the atomic bomb. You have the development of weapons and technologies like drones and intercontinental ballistic missile systems that, again, essentially you allow to do that deterrence from very far distances. You have the creation of a base empire that allows you to threaten people implicitly, what the U.S. refers to as deterrence, from those bases that don't require much land, that don't require many people to man them. And you have, after Vietnam, the creation in 1973, I believe, of the all-volunteer force, which means that the bourgeoisie no longer fights America's wars, that most people don't fight America's wars, that it's a very small military that mostly consists of people in the South and the West that grow up near a military base or have a relative in the military. So you're creating kind of like a militarized class. Gene, I know you're a specialist on Turkey, so this is probably right, but I've heard it referred to as kind of a Janissary corps. I'm not sure if that's correct, but some sort of soldier class. So what you have,
like an elite class.
Yeah. So what you have is a situation of domestic decay accompanied with the reality that the empire doesn't need that many people to run it. So the issue is that this empire could kind of keep on going for autopilot for quite a while, I think.
I'd like to respond to that, because there are a couple of things that I think that you've elided. And one is that many countries that are within the American sphere have a relatively comfortable experience with American hegemony. I'm thinking Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, much of Southeast Asia. There are opportunities that come with being being part of that American zone. You have markets for your exports, access to technology. You also have movement of elites, circulation of the bourgeois strata from places like the Philippines, places Latin America, not to say all of the West, through the United States, through American institutions, many people with dual citizenship. So there's just looking at the American hegemony as an American phenomenon loses sight of all of the international buy-in that actually goes with the system. Mm-hmm. There are reasons why other countries acquiesce to American rule that don't have to do with fear of getting vaporized by nuclear weapons, mm-hmm. and have to do with pragmatic calculations of where their own interests lie. Because
could you be specific about which countries? Because I think it's true for some and not for others.
So, for instance, Japan, right?
Yeah, sure. Japan, the people who are in the core. Yeah, the core has it pretty good. North Atlantic, Japan, South Korea,
Singapore, Malaysia.
Totally. Yes, those countries aren't going to love it. But I think the United States doesn't have the material capacity to, if China invades Taiwan, for example, I do not think the United States would respond.
Well, there's also the question of what warfighting sub-nuclear annihilation looks like. And you made the point that the military bases, the American sort of archipelago of force projection, doesn't require a lot of land, doesn't require a lot of people to man it, but it actually requires a tremendous amount of logistical support. The infrastructure needs to be robust.
Yeah.
The technology, for instance, the F-35 is incredibly frail, right? It might be invisible in the air, but it actually stays grounded for 10x or more the amount of time that it can actually fly. And not only that, but all the technology that goes into it, the supply chains that need to manufacture it. So that may actually be the real vulnerability, that the decay doesn't come from social problems or inequality at home. The decay comes from the breakdown of international political economy, right? It turns out that a lot of those chips are being manufactured by countries that are vulnerable to Chinese influence. A lot of rare earth metals are sourced from locations that are not necessarily under American control. And that technology may actually be the Achilles heel. On the one hand, it allows you to divorce yourself from American mass politics, but it also makes you subject to a different type of material constraint.
I want to add on to that. I think the other side of this kind of like economic hegemony is the cultural hegemony, like Ramsey. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, America dominated the world not only by nuclear power, but also by Coca-Cola, Wonder Bra. So there is no other cultural alternative to think about. Like France, they have their own music, but still they have a lot of people like singing American country music because like America is cool and it's progress. It's ideal, but then this image is also failing and. It's no longer. I don't think it's a light tower to like democracy anymore.
Not the city on the hill, and the cultural element is also eroding.
Yeah, I don't think soft power is that important. Fundamentally, that was an argument that Joe Nye started making in like 1980, 81. I just don't think it's not that important what songs people sing. I think you're going to find indigenous. You're already seeing it in India. You're seeing it in China. You're even seeing it in Europe. Now there's the rise of indigenous cultural industries. I agree that that's sort of like America is not going to be like rock and roll and blue jeans anymore. That heyday is over. I just don't think it's that important.
I don't like this concept of soft power. I think there's a lot of problem with it. It's like you're kind of changing this social like this thoughts like that people just literally don't have any alternative. Like they cannot think of another way where this world operates without US. It's different from soft power where like you're like a parasite into people's body and you brainwash them. I think it's completely different.
But and also soft power in the fall of the Soviet Union played an enormous role. The mobilization of protests against communist governments in Eastern Europe especially were motivated by the image of prosperity, of freedom, of coolness, of being attractive, of travel, of glamour. That looked like it was broadly available.
I'm not sure I agree just as historical, but I think that's a different conversation.
Let me pivot. Let me kind of go off on this question. What about if there's a combination of the cultural soft power or the cultural penetration and actually State Department subterfuge? For example, in Cuba right now, State Department sponsoring hip-hop groups internally that are using the popularity of rap music to destabilize a communist government that's viewed as an enemy to the United States.
I mean, I think that this is probably, I just disagree with you all. I just like as a causal factor and why things happen, I think culture is ultimately of tertiary importance usually. And I mean, I base that on a particular time period that I study, which is, the Cold War mostly, but I haven't found it to really explain why things happen. Maybe it's changed minds in certain circumstances, but in my opinion, hearts and minds are less important than guns and butter. But that's just an opinion. And some people, I respect disagreement.
I'm not saying that it's a definitive. I don't think it's. I mean, ultimately, listen. When you want to have power, the guns are the ultimate power. The weapons are the ultimate power. That's what you want to have the most. But what I'm saying is that you don't always want to have to pull the trigger. And what I'm saying is that it's not. I agree with you. I agree with you. The culture is not the definitive tool.
What happens when the people who are holding the guns, when your own security apparatus refuses to use them, like in the case of the collapse of the USSR or the end of communism in Eastern Europe? You have the defection of rank and file soldiers from the support of the regime, regardless of how many guns they have. And that is a psychocultural phenomenon.
Maybe. I mean, like, then we're getting into like deep causal mechanisms, and it is in part a psychocultural phenomenon. I agree. I think it would be impossible to totally discount the role of psychology, but I'm curious how it'd be very difficult to make causal arguments in that direction. Though I agree that is certainly a factor.
That's ultimately some of the difficulty with establishing causality in history in a general sense, because of course we can't run counterfactual historical experiments and change variables in order to
Hangzhou comes online.
not until we get some supercomputers. But it is actually, I think the intersection between culture, like economics and power, is an extremely important dynamic to conceptualize in terms of demoralizing people, or at least shaping the political horizons. Because ultimately, I mean, I would say, Daniel, isn't imperialist realism, it's a product of a particular material
yes.
order of interest. But the ideological superstructure, the reason we would discuss it is because would you say that it has some relevance in shaping,
right?
Is it
I think
highly derivative?
This gets into an important distinction. I think that culture has a much more maintaining function than it does as a one for causal change. That is a fine distinction, but it's an important one. So when we're looking at why massive changes happen, these like what they call in German like a Wendepunkt, like a serious change, the end of feudalism, the end of aristocracy, the end of empire. I think that is very rarely culturally driven. But I agree in sort of the Gramscian sense that hegemony, the way regimes maintain, they manufacture consent, culture is an increasingly, an incredibly important factor, even if it's very difficult to measure in terms of how exactly culture plays into maintenance.
Daniel, are you familiar with the book Jazz Diplomacy?
Is that by Penny Von Eschen? She wrote Satchmo Blows Up the World. It's on, I'm familiar with like work in that vein. Yeah.
Because on the culture,
as ambassadors play the Cold War, Penny Von Eschen,
on the cultural tip, we do realize that one of the ways in which the United States fought the potential expansion and popularity of Soviet communism in the global South was to export Black popular culture, particularly jazz.
Yeah, so I mean, I've written on this in an academic setting. I think that these arguments were made in the 1990s, partially because they reflect the end of history moment, which really saw political and economic questions recede to the background. Also, the transformations in the American historical profession, particularly diplomatic history. So I think those, in my personal opinion, a lot of that scholarship is important, and I don't want to deride it, but I think it made larger causal claims than was, in my opinion, accurate.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that, just about culture? So in terms of these aspects of sort of, let's say, soft power or cultural imperialism, however you want to look at it, are they, in a sense, a function of this imperialist realism, in a sense that, even though culture is not essential to actually forwarding the empire. It is the idea that American culture is something that could change the world. Is that a function of the delusions of the foreign policy class?
I mean, it's a liberal idea. I mean, if you go back to the formation of that idea in the U.S. Information Agency, which is something I actually study a lot in my first book, it's this notion, it's this like anti-Marxist notion that you're going to use culture to change hearts and minds. You get this like, really, this is a project of the 50s and the early 60s. It really ends fairly quickly, actually, because they don't get the returns that they want, that they're spending all this money on the cultural Cold War, which again becomes this big topic in the 1990s. But, by the mid 60s, late 60s, I think they're spending much less money on that and a lot more money doing, what we on the left always criticize in terms of the CIA, in terms of the large, Vietnam, for example, the funding of proxy wars around the world. So, yeah, I think it is a function. It's a very Habermasian idea, right? That like these sort of liberal notions are going to really result in cultural change. And I just don't think that's especially accurate.
So you're not a fan of Francis Stoner Saunders, Cultural Cold War?
I think again, it's not a matter of being a fan. It's like these histories emerged at a particular moment. And it's not a surprise to me that at the fucking apex of neoliberal globalization, everyone's writing about the importance of culture. I think they overemphasized it. Like, I'm sure I'm overemphasizing something now. I'm a product of my own moment. So I think that book is very important. But again, I think it exaggerated the causal impact of a lot of these cultural claims. I really do.
Well, before we go, I did want to address this question, let you guys, the panel, address this super chat question. Thank you very much, Infinite Content. Serious question. If the Global South nationalizes their resources, would the USA get to sanctions or the CIA get to cooing or both?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think in a lot of the Global South countries, that nationalization, again, emerged from a particular post-colonial moment that no longer really exists. Marx said that either the transnational working class would become conscious in and of itself, or, we'd suffer the ruin of the contending classes. And I think we're kind of in that latter moment, at least right now. There's, I think, very little space right now for people to exist outside of capitalism. I think it's genuinely conquered the globe, which Marx always said was a possibility. So I don't see how a government could nationalize it without basically committing suicide in a real sense, barring some exogenous shock. There could always be an exogenous shock, a massive war, a meteor, genuine climate change that affects power elites. That could always happen. But at the moment, as I see it now, I don't even see how such nationalizations could take place, or at least in a way that they would take place without being amalgamated into the larger neoliberal system.
Well, yeah, to pick up on that, Saudi Aramco was a national oil monopoly. The Emiratis have a national oil monopoly. Statoil in Norway is a national oil monopoly. It all depends on what you mean by nationalize. If you just nationalize and you create a state-controlled enterprise that sells on the international market at a competitive price and will continue to supply clients in the United States, then it's actually not that big a deal. It's a question of neutralizing the opposition of the people that you're expropriating, and dealing, putting out some political fires that might go along with the sectoral links between your country and the United States. But there are ways that you can nationalize and get away with it. There are ways where you could nationalize and it wouldn't even matter that much. There's another question here, which is you got to take apart the black box of American foreign policy. It's not a single, nerve center that makes all of the decisions out of Langley. There's a heterogeneous set of actors. Some are private sector. Some are subsidiary elements within the security apparatus that actually have a tremendous amount of autonomy, but over a very narrow area. Then, like Congress also plays a role. And once you get to a granular level, and once you get to a specific country with a specific resource, then it becomes a list of like 20 people that you need to neutralize or co-opt, and you could make it stick. But that's not always easy.
The very reason why this couldn't happen, I feel like it illustrates my earlier point about cultural hegemony. This this, I think this lies in the core of the American power, the dominance of school of economics, the Hayekian thought of a free market, just make it impossible to do that.
Capitalist realism.
Yes, and imagine in that after during 1997 financial crisis, East Southeast Asian countries just basically all accepted the IMF packages,
except for Mohammed Mahathir's Malaysia.
Yes, and recently I've seen academic papers starting to discuss that. Is that really a good thing? But it has been 20 years after, and then it started finally as, oh, so this kind of gray like Hayekian thought is not necessarily a good thing. So imagine like that. I think that is also a very, very strong drive of this.
You mentioned like a maintaining force on the intellectual hegemony, the not just foreign policy thinking, but also economic thinking that keeps the entire project moving. Kind of like you said.
And I think about like in the 1920s when this was a live question. The famous socialist calculation debate, right? Socialists are really arguing about there's a reason we don't ever hear about that anymore, right? There's a reason that because it's not a live possibility. And I think as a leftist, I think one of the most important things that at least I try to do is look at power from like the most cynical, most pessimistic perspective. And I think that's where we're at. And we need to really recognize this sort of very, very, very weak position we are before we try to build out from there. So I just wanted to let people know this. That's my perspective.
Well, we are over an hour because Cuba and Summer are just so adorable with their combined back and forth. And you can only imagine what the dinner conversations are like. If you are a patron, we are going to keep this conversation going. Dr. Bessner, will you be joining us in the second half?
Yeah, I could stay for about 20 more minutes if that's cool.
Oh, that's totally fine.
Cool. Yeah.
You might be able to help Pascal and I with a little bit of a music question we have.
I'll try.
Before we head off.
Nirvana. The answer is Nirvana.
No, that's never the answer.
It is always the answer.
Never the answer. Oh, by the way, real quick, Daniel, did you go when you interviewed Buzz? Did you do it in LA?
It was actually in the middle of COVID. So I was in LA, but it was via Zoom.
If you get a chance to go to that studio.
Oh, I'd love to. I'd love to meet them in real life. I'm really a big fan of the Melvins.
Well, you know Conan, so that's just a matter of
Yeah.
But there is a question, and this goes out to the chat as well, and it's kind of a two-part question. Pascal and I have been having a very, very heated debate about who is the greatest light-skinned R&B singer of all time.
And I won.
Nirvana.
They are light-skinned.
Between Howard Hewitt and Eldebarge. Is Daniel Googling who Howard Hewitt is?
No.
Because if so, that would be awesome. And also, we're debating who classifies as black yacht rock.
Oh, God. I'm going to go ahead and say Nirvana.
It's always the answer.
So that's a very small part of what we're going to be talking about. We're, of course, going to be continuing this conversation. Thank you guys for checking it out. If you're not a patron, wherever you're watching this show, there's a link in the description. Click the link and watch the bonus half of this show. Until then.
Also, once we get to 1,000 patrons.
Oh, I keep forgetting to say that. So once we get to 1,000 patrons, and if the world is safe, we're going to do a live show somewhere in California. Not saying where necessarily. Somewhere in California.
Undisclosed location.
Right now.
And you get to meet Pascal and party with Pascal backstage.
I'm still debating.
Pascal will scowl at you personally.
That's the only reason why people want to go there.
They want to get a picture with Pascal scowling at them.
Eating
scowling
biscuits.
I'll have to bring my soldiers.
Your no limit soldiers?
My Mau soldiers.
Uh-oh. On that note, people, we are